You wake up tired. Even after you have slept, your body may still move through the same routines, but something inside you feels heavier. You have less patience for noise, less desire to impress people, and less energy for conversations that no longer mean anything to you. At first, you may think this is simply what happens with age. But perhaps you are not tired because you're getting older. Perhaps you are tired because you have been carrying a life that no longer fits the person you have become. For years, you carried responsibilities, expectations, old fears, and identities that once helped you survive. But what protects you in one season can imprison you in another. There comes a point when growth is no longer about adding more success, more approval, more things to prove. Sometimes the next chapter begins when you finally become willing to put something down. The weight you feel is not always the weight of age. And it is not always the result of having too much to do. Sometimes it comes from the quiet distance between the life you are living and the person you have become. For many years, you may have done what responsible people do. You worked, provided, endured, adjusted, stayed strong when others needed strength, and carried duties that could not simply be put aside. But over time, responsibility can become so deeply woven into identity that you stop asking whether the person carrying everything is still alive beneath the role. You become the dependable one, the reasonable one, the one who keeps the family together, the one who solves the problem, the one who absorbs the pressure. This is where the heaviness begins. Not because responsibility is wrong, but because no human being can live forever as a function for everyone else and remain untouched inside. There are parts of you that may have been quiet for decades. A desire you postponed because the timing was never right. A truth you swallowed because peace seemed more important. A boundary you abandoned because someone might have been disappointed. A dream you called unrealistic because life demanded practicality. They were small sacrifices made in the name of survival, family, duty, stability, and belonging. But a life is shaped by what is repeated. One compromise becomes a pattern. One pattern becomes a character. And one day you look around and realize that the house of your life is standing, but you no longer feel at home inside it. This can be difficult to admit, especially when the life you built looks respectable from the outside. You can appreciate what you have built and still recognize that something within you has been neglected. What protects a person during one season can quietly imprison that person in another. The armor that helped you endure rejection can later prevent intimacy. The silence that once kept the peace can later become the inability to speak honestly. The habit of being strong can become the shame of admitting that you are tired. This is why inner heaviness is often misunderstood. People try to solve it by adding something new. But if the foundation is cracked, polishing the rooms will not make the house feel safe. If the identity itself has become too narrow, adding more achievements only gives the old structure more weight to carry. There comes a moment when wisdom asks you to stop decorating what no longer fits and begin examining what it was built upon. Whose voice do you hear when you tell yourself that rest is laziness, that change is selfish, that it is too late to begin again, that you must remain the person everyone already understands? Many of the rules that govern your life were never consciously chosen. They were inherited. They came from parents carrying their own fears, from communities that rewarded conformity, from workplaces that measured worth through productivity, from relationships that became comfortable only when you stayed predictable. Over time, these voices became so familiar that they began to sound like your own. That is the danger of a borrowed identity. It feels like personality. It feels like this is simply who I am. But the deeper self is not always the loudest voice. Often it is the one you have ignored because listening to it would require change. It speaks through restlessness. It speaks through exhaustion that sleep does not fully repair. It speaks through the strange sadness that can appear even when nothing is obviously wrong. These signals are not always signs that your life is falling apart. Sometimes they are signs that something within you is refusing to remain buried. The discomfort may be asking for honesty, not escape. It may be asking you to look beneath the roles, beneath the history, beneath the expectations, and see what remains when you are no longer performing the person you learned to be. This is not a call to destroy everything you have built. It is a call to stop confusing the structure of your life with the truth of your identity. You do not need to reject your past in order to outgrow parts of it. Blame keeps you attached to what happened. Awareness allows you to learn from it. The first movement is simpler and more difficult. You must become willing to see clearly. You must notice where your life feels heavy, where your words no longer match your truth, where your habits continue only because they are familiar, where you are still asking permission to become someone more honest. This kind of seeing can feel uncomfortable because once you see the crack in the foundation, you cannot return completely to pretending it is not there. But that discomfort is not the end of the path. It is the beginning of a more truthful one. Before anything new can be built, you must recognize what has become too small to contain you. Before freedom can feel natural, you must see the old shape you have been forcing yourself to occupy. And before you can hear the quieter voice beneath years of duty and expectation, you must become willing to loosen the identity that has been wrapped around you for so long. The next step is not to fight that old identity and not to hate the person who needed it. The next step is to understand that a skin can protect you for a season and still need to be shed when the season has changed. A skin can protect you for a season and still need to be shed when the season has changed. The difficulty is that most people do not recognize the old skin as something separate from themselves. They have worn it for so long that it feels like identity. The cautious person says, "This is simply who I am." The person who avoids conflict says, "I have always been this way." The person who constantly puts others first calls it kindness, even when resentment has begun to grow underneath. The person who never rests calls exhaustion responsibility. The person who hides what they truly want calls surrender maturity. This is how an old identity survives. It does not announce itself as a prison. It speaks with your own voice. It uses your history as evidence. It reminds you of what happened the last time you trusted, failed, spoke honestly, took a risk, or disappointed someone. Then it tells you to remain small, because small feels familiar. But familiarity is not always truth. Sometimes familiarity is only repetition that has been practiced for decades. You repeat a belief long enough, and eventually you stop recognizing it as a belief. You begin treating it as a fact. You tell yourself you are too old to change direction, too damaged to trust again, too responsible to choose differently, too established to admit that something no longer fits. Yet these conclusions are often built from moments that happened many years ago. A rejection becomes a rule about love. A failure becomes a rule about ability. A painful marriage becomes a rule about closeness. A difficult childhood becomes a rule about worth. A season of scarcity becomes a lifelong fear of not having enough. The event ends, But the rule remains. The danger is not only what happened to you, the deeper danger is the identity you built around what happened and then continued obeying long after the original threat disappeared. This is why letting go requires more courage than adding something new. Adding feels productive. It gives the mind something to achieve. Another book, another routine, another goal, another promise to improve. But subtraction asks a more uncomfortable question. What if the person trying so hard to improve is still protecting the very beliefs that keep the old life in place? You cannot walk freely while dragging every former version of yourself behind you. At some point, wisdom requires you to stop asking what else you should become and begin asking what you no longer need to carry. Maybe you no longer need the belief that everyone must understand your choices. Maybe you no longer need to earn rest through exhaustion. Maybe you no longer need to remain loyal to a role simply because you have played it for 30 years. Maybe you no longer need to protect an image of strength that leaves no room for honesty. Letting go does not mean declaring war on the person you used to be. That person deserves understanding. The old identity was often built for a reason. It may have helped you survive a home where emotions were unsafe. It may have helped you endure years when there was no room for weakness. It may have taught you how to provide, how to persist, how to keep moving when stopping was not an option. Do not insult the armor that once kept you alive, but do not confuse gratitude for the armor with a promise to wear it forever. There is a time to protect yourself, and there is a time to recognize that protection has become restriction. A bird does not hate the shell because it eventually breaks through it. The shell served its purpose, then life required more space. Your old identity can be honored in the same way. You can look at the fearful version of yourself and understand why fear once made sense. You can look at the people-pleasing version of yourself and understand why acceptance once felt necessary. You can look at the angry version of yourself and see how anger may have protected pain that had nowhere else to go. Understanding removes the need for hatred, and without hatred, release becomes cleaner. You do not have to destroy the old self. You simply stop feeding it. You stop repeating the sentence that keeps the fear alive. You stop returning automatically to the reaction that belongs to another decade. You stop explaining every boundary as if your life were still waiting for permission. You begin noticing the moment an old identity tries to take control. And instead of obeying it, you remain present long enough to choose differently. This is how the skin begins to loosen, not through one dramatic decision, but through small acts of disobedience toward the patterns that no longer deserve authority. You speak when the old self wants to disappear. You rest when the old self demands that you prove your worth through effort. You say no when the old self fears rejection. You allow yourself not to know when the old self needs certainty. Every one of these moments creates a small distance between who you were trained to be and who you are consciously choosing to become. At first, that distance can feel unsettling. The old identity was familiar, even when it was painful. Without it, you may not immediately know who you are. This is the part many people misunderstand. They expect freedom to feel exciting from the beginning. Often, it feels empty first. When you stop chasing approval, there is silence where other people's reactions used to be. When you stop filling every hour with responsibility, there is space where busyness used to protect you from yourself. When you stop repeating the old story, there is a quiet moment before a new way of living has taken shape. Do not rush to fill that space. Do not panic because the old voice has become quieter and the new one has not yet become clear. The empty space is not proof that something is missing. It is evidence that something has finally been removed. And if you can resist the urge to cover that emptiness with more noise, more approval, more distraction, or another identity, you will discover that the space itself has something to teach you. Once the old skin begins to fall away, the next stage cannot be found in the crowd. It begins in the place most people avoid, the quiet place where there is nothing left to perform and nowhere left to hide from yourself. The quiet place where there is nothing left to perform and nowhere left to hide from yourself is where the next part of the journey begins. At first, silence may not feel peaceful. It may feel uncomfortable, empty, even strangely threatening. For years, you may have filled every open space with movement, responsibility, television, conversation, work, news, errand, music, or the small distractions that make it possible to avoid being fully alone with your own mind. The noise may have changed over the decades, but its purpose often remained the same. It kept you occupied enough that deeper questions did not have to be answered. When the noise finally becomes quieter, those questions begin to rise. What am I still carrying? What have I been avoiding? What do I actually want now? What part of my life is still being lived from fear? These questions can feel heavier than the noise you used to escape them. And this is why many people turn back at the gate of silence. They reach for the phone, turn on the television, find someone to call, create another task, or begin worrying about something that gives the mind a familiar problem to solve. Busyness feels safer than stillness because busyness keeps your attention pointed outward. Silence turns the attention inward. And once the attention turns inward, you begin to see how much activity was never truly necessary. It was simply protection from yourself. Solitude must be understood correctly. It is not isolation from life, and it is not the rejection of people. It is the practice of becoming present enough that you no longer need constant company to protect you from your own thoughts. There is a difference between being alone and being abandoned. One is a condition. The other is a story the mind creates around that condition. A person can sit in a crowded room and feel deeply abandoned, and another person can sit alone in complete silence and feel whole. The difference is not the number of people nearby. The difference is whether you have learned how to remain in your own presence without immediately trying to escape it. This becomes increasingly important as life changes, children grow older, careers slow down or end, relationships change, familiar roles become smaller, and the identity built around being needed may begin to loosen. If your entire sense of worth came from being useful to others, quiet can feel like disappearance. If your value depended on being constantly occupied, rest can feel like failure. If your identity depended on being surrounded by people who reflected a familiar version of you, solitude can feel like losing yourself. But this is exactly why silence becomes a gate. It separates the identity that required constant reinforcement from the deeper self that can exist without an audience. When you sit quietly, you begin to notice how quickly the mind tries to create movement. It revisits old conversations. It imagines future problems. It remembers someone who hurt you 20 years ago. It rehearses explanations you may never need to give. It creates urgency where there is none. Do not be surprised by this. The mind has been trained by repetition, and a mind trained to chase noise will not become still simply because the room becomes quiet. Silence is not the absence of thought. It is the space in which you learn that thought does not always require obedience. You can notice a memory without following it for the next hour. You can feel regret without turning the entire past into a courtroom. You can feel loneliness without calling someone who repeatedly disturbs your peace. You can feel uncertainty without demanding an immediate answer. This is the beginning of inner discipline, not controlling every thought, but refusing to let every thought control your direction. At first, the practice can be simple. Sit without reaching for stimulation. Walk without filling your ears. Drink your morning coffee before opening the door to the entire world. Let 5 quiet minutes remain. 5 quiet minutes. Notice the urge to escape and do not immediately obey it. The purpose is not to become impressive at meditation or to create another identity around being spiritual. The purpose is to recover the ability to be with yourself without needing distraction as a form of rescue. Over time, the silence becomes less empty. You begin to hear things that noise had covered. You notice when your body tightens around certain memories. You notice which names still disturb your breathing. You notice which fears have been quietly making decisions for you. You notice how much of your inner conversation is built from voices that do not belong to you. Some of these discoveries will be peaceful, others will not. Silence does not promise comfort. It offers clarity, and clarity can be uncomfortable because it removes the stories that allowed you to remain unchanged. You may see that a relationship has been draining you for years. You may see that your anger is protecting grief. You may see that your need to control everything is rooted in fear. You may see that the person you blame for your unhappiness has been gone for a long time, while the argument continues inside your own mind. This is why solitude becomes training. It gives you a place to observe without immediately reacting. In ordinary life, emotion moves quickly into action. Someone disappoints you, and you speak. Fear rises, and you retreat. Loneliness appears, and you reach for comfort. In silence, you begin to place a little space between the feeling and the response. That space may be only one breath at first, but one breath is enough to begin. You are learning that you can experience an emotion without allowing it to become an order. You are learning that discomfort can enter the room without becoming the owner of the room. And as this practice deepens, solitude no longer feels like absence. It becomes a place where scattered parts of you begin to gather again. Your attention returns. Your breathing slows. Your choices become less dependent on immediate emotion. The voice beneath the noise becomes easier to recognize, not because it shouts, but because you finally stop drowning it out. Yet this is also where the path becomes more demanding. Once the room is quiet enough, you can no longer pretend that the shadows inside you are not there. The fears, attachments, wounds, and emotional dependencies that noise helped you avoid begin to take shape. Silence opens the gate. But what waits beyond that gate must still be faced. Silence opens the gate. But what waits beyond that gate must still be faced. When the noise becomes quiet enough, the things you have avoided do not disappear. They become easier to see. Fear begins to show its true shape. Old resentment rises without the distractions that once kept it buried. The need for approval becomes more obvious when there is no audience nearby to satisfy it. Memories you thought you had left behind return with surprising force, not because the past has suddenly become stronger, but because you are finally present enough to notice how much of it still lives inside your reactions. This is where the path becomes less comfortable and more honest. It is easy to speak about peace when nothing is disturbing you. It is easy to believe you are free when no one is touching the places where you are still afraid.